We are told that sin is in the reaction, not in the action. Does this mean that if someone doesn't have a reaction, it is not considered a sin for them? Are there universal sins and ones that are subjective to the person? Can this idea be used in ethical practices? For example, something I consider a good or right action may not be considered that way from another's perspective. Therefore, is sin or wrongdoing subjective? Okay. So let's start by looking at these ideas of sin, a lot associated with conviction, conscience, for which we need to have a bit of a look at the human constitution. So let's start there. So the diagram on the right is symbolic of the human constitution, the things that we are made up of. On the outer edges are the grosser elements of the personality, and as you go in towards the center, you contact subtler and subtler parts. So the grossest aspect of the personality is the physical body, the thing that you see in the mirror when you look. Within, if you like, is the mind. The mind is the seat of our desires, our emotions, our preferences, our likes and dislikes. It's non-rational by nature. Subtler than the mind, you have the gross intellect. So the intellect is fundamentally the capacity to discriminate. And we use that discrimination for our objective observation, our reasoning, drawing conclusions, setting goals, all that kind of thing. Subtler than the gross intellect is the so-called subtle intellect. It has the same fundamental principle of discrimination, but where the gross intellect discriminates between the infinite pairs of opposites that make up the world, the subtle intellect has only one pair of opposites that it discriminates. So the gross intellect discriminates between, say, pleasure and pain, good and bad, up, down, moral, immoral, the infinite pairs of opposites that make up the world. The subtle intellect on one side puts the entire terrestrial world, all of those opposites, everything in the waking state, dream state, and deep sleep state. And on the other side, it puts not that. Terrestrial versus transcendental. So that idea of the transcendental, it's referring to the very subject of your experiences rather than the thing that you experience. So you experience things in the external world, the objects for the senses. You experience your emotions. You experience your thoughts. You experience your conclusions. But there is always that sense of a subject which is experiencing those things. The subtle intellect is that part of the personality that posits that subject as distinct and different from everything that it can contact. Subtler again is the causal body, which are the dormant or unmanifest tendencies, and subtler again is the essential self, that very thing that the subtle intellect is positing. So the elements that we are concerned with here are the gross intellect and the subtle intellect. The gross intellect forms convictions, statements of fact, things that it knows to be true and right. We establish our convictions through reflection, through our thinking. And so we end up with statements that we make to ourselves saying, this is true, this is the right thing, this is my obligation. So it sets the direction for our life when we use it. So that's why it's like the wheel of a ship or the rudder of a ship. It points the direction for us to go. So it directs the mind and the body. The subtle intellect has a voice that we call the conscience. Remember, the subtle intellect points towards your true self, the subject that is contacting the layers of your personality and the external world. Because it posits that true self, what we say then is that it points away from the ego. So what is the ego? The ego is the false identity that we currently claim is who and what we are. What's a good analogy for this? In the dream state. When you are in the dream, you believe yourself to be that particular character. Now, in that dream, you could have a whole range of different emotions, values, actions. You could even have a different body to the one that you have in the waking state. And yet, you firmly believe that you are that person. That is the identity that you claim. That false identity is the ego. What Vedanta says is that we have that same affliction here in the waking state. That we have an identity based on the layers of the personality, but that there is at the core a true self that is not defined by any of the qualities and properties of your body, mind, intellect. The subtle intellect posits the existence of that true self as distinct and separate from the ego. So it's like then a mariner's compass. It points away from ego and egocentric demands. That's why it's the conscience. The conscience is that part of our personality that always tells us the right thing to do. So moral or right in this sense means that it points away from the ego. It's selfless. How is this all relevant to what we're talking about? We have the ability as human beings to violate our convictions and our conscience. My conviction says to me that when somebody wrongs me, the correct thing to do is to try and understand their perspective, set the correct boundaries, but have a sense of compassion for where they're coming from. And that is what I believe I should do. But in practice, when someone wrongs me, my emotions take over, and instead, I act in a way to belittle them. I act in a way to try and cause them more pain. I lack compassion. I've gone against what I believe is the right thing. So too with the conscience. There are things that my ego wants. I have egocentric demands. If I act in a way that is in accordance with my ego, then I'm acting against my conscience. Instead, I'm acting based on personalized desire and attachment. What happens when we do this? What happens when we violate our conviction and our conscience? We've all experienced this. Regret, sorrow, suffering, agitation. This negative reaction that our own personality has to violating conscience and conviction, this is sin. Sin is the negative reaction that arises from our own nature. So let's go back to the question. Sin is in the reaction, not in the action. Does this mean that if there's no reaction, it's not a sin? Yes, that's exactly what it means. If you perform an action and your own nature doesn't rebound with that sense of regret, with that sense of agitation, remorse, then you have not committed a sin for you. However, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we don't perceive a reaction doesn't mean there isn't one. Let's stay with the same example. Somebody wrongs me and I take revenge instead of having compassion. If I lack self-awareness, the negative reaction that comes into my personality is missed. I just don't see it. It's a bit like being partially deaf and not hearing someone knocking at your door. The fact that you don't hear it doesn't mean that they're not knocking. It's just that your hearing is not good enough. Similarly, Your personality may be reacting with agitation and regret, but if we lack self-awareness, we won't be aware of it. Another problem is that we become acclimatized to agitation, so that we may be sort of aware of the agitation, but not aware enough for it to draw our attention and make us question. What's a good analogy for this? You go to your workplace, and just outside the window, on the other side of the street, there are workmen jackhammering into the cement. You get there at 9 o'clock and they're going all morning. What happens at 12:30? They break for lunch. At that moment, when the jackhammer goes off, silence. Up until that point, you had become so acclimatized to the noise that you weren't even aware that it was there until it stopped. The same kind of thing can happen. There's a background buzzing of agitation because of a range of different factors, one of which is the fact that we have been violating conscience and conviction, but it blends into the rest, and so we don't feel it, we don't notice it. The third problem that we might face is that we might feel mental agitation, we might be fully aware of it, but we wrongly attribute it. The reason I'm so frustrated is because of that thing happening at my work, or that thing happening in my relationship, or this thing not going right with my business. What's actually happening is that I am violating my conscience and conviction. I'm getting mental agitation as a result, but I'm not able to link cause and effect correctly. I notice the effect, but I say the cause is somewhere else. So while it's true that if I don't have a reaction, I haven't committed a sin, simply saying I don't feel a reaction doesn't mean there isn't one there. Are there universal sins and ones that are subjective to the person? Again, yes, this is exactly what it means. Individual sins means that it's your own conscience and conviction. You don't share a conscience and conviction with other people. So what the right thing for you to do is could be the wrong thing for another. What's a simple example? Two people are in a workplace, and one is afflicted with a superiority complex, and they think that they know the best. They think that they are most knowledgeable, that everybody wants to hear from them, that it's their job to lead the way in discussions. For them, that arrogant superiority complex means that their conscience would say to them, quieten down. Another person in the same room is afflicted with an inferiority complex. Ego as well. Oh, I'm not good enough to speak. Anything I say won't be taken seriously. If I make a mistake, I'll be laughed at. I don't know enough. Their conscience is saying to them, speak up. Because for them, hiding in the ego is to say nothing. Two individuals, same scenario, conscience is telling them to do opposite actions. Are there universal sins? Yes, because we have a common humanity. There are universal principles that are true for all of us in the way we conduct ourselves in the world. So you could imagine, for example, any range of legal and moral crimes that there would never be a justification for. Why? Because we do share a common humanity. More than that, we share a common consciousness. You could extend that out not just to the human race, but to sentient beings in general. Can this idea be used in ethical practices? For example, something I consider a right action may not be from another's perspective. Therefore, is sin or wrongdoing subjective? So this is much the same question that we've already covered. Yes. The implication of that is that you can't judge another person's actions per se. You can't look at the action, the surface expression, and judge that. That person may not be violating their conviction and their conscience. And to ask them to act in a way that is aligned to how I act might be violating their conscience. There's a beautiful scene in the movie A Man for All Seasons. So Thomas More is being asked to sign a document which supports the divorce of King Henry and his remarriage. So Thomas More refuses to sign based on his religious principles. Everybody else in the court has signed. And one of his friends in the court says to him, "Won't you sign it for solidarity?" And Thomas More's answer is brilliant here. He says, when you go to heaven for following your conscience, and I go to hell for not following mine, will you join me for solidarity? It's a beautiful way to phrase it, because what he's saying is, I'm not judging you for signing the document, you're following your conscience. So you should not judge me for not signing it, because I'm following mine. We are told that sin is in the reaction, not in the action. Does this mean that if someone doesn't have a reaction, it's not a sin for them? Yes. But be careful with that information. Are there universal sins and ones that are subjective? Yes, that's exactly what it means. What's right for you may not be for me, and vice versa. Is sin or wrongdoing subjective? Yes. This is why it's so important for us to self-reflect, so that we can formulate clear convictions, so that we can have a sense of what is right or wrong for us. And importantly, we need to be able to learn to access the conscience. In the vast majority of cases, our conviction is sufficient. But there'll be times where our conviction itself is uncertain. All the thinking, all the reasoning, should I do A or B? This is the pro list, this is the cons list, these are the potential outcomes. We weigh up everything and our intellect is still at a stalemate. I still don't know if I should do A or B. At that point, when our gross intellect is essentially exhausted, when we are surrendered, that we do not know, and the mind is calm, then we can access the conscience and it will speak to us. You feel it. You'll know now what you should do, not because of a conclusion drawn out of the intellect, but because of a voice of the subtle intellect. When you hear the conscience, you will immediately be reconciled. If you believe you've heard the voice of the conscience and you react to that voice with more chatter, more commentary, it's more likely that this is simply the mind's preference. The conscience, when we hear it, we accept it. We have surrendered to it. In much the same way as if we have a trusted mentor and we go with a problem where we've done all the thinking that we can and we've reached a stalemate and we ask that trusted mentor, should I do A or B? And you know that whatever they say, you're going to accept it and follow. It's that kind of surrender. So even if the conscience brings us something that does not match our preferences, we're reconciled.